Hi all, thanks for coming out today. Today is the dawn of spring break. It's great to see so many people out. Although I had this written the opposite way too, just in case there wasn't many people out. It's exactly the same. So, I'm Casey Boyle, the director of the Digital Writing Research Lab and faculty in the Department of Rhetoric Writing. Today's talk is sponsored by both my department and the lab itself. We decided to host this talk today as a kind of response to the wider and anxious discussions around student writing and AI. That is large language models in general and ChatGPT and OpenAI in particular. We thought this conversation was a good opportunity to share our discipline's knowledge about writing pedagogy alongside our expertise in the computational humanities and rhetorics and AI. Today's talk will not answer all those questions, but it will hopefully introduce another essential voice in the discussion. So I'm going to like to introduce our speaker today, but the one problem I have is that writing these introductions have always been my bane of my existence. I hate them. Too sincere, and it always comes across wrong. Too factual, and I might as well be reading someone's CV. So I decided instead to turn to ChatGPT, of course, to write this introduction. Here's an introduction. The prompt I gave it was a bunch of Scott's, gave it his CV, and this is what we came up with. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Scott Graham, an accomplished associate professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. He is affiliated with the Center for Health Communication, the University Texas Opioid Response Consortium, and the Health Informatics Research Interest Group. His research has been supported by the National Endowment for Humanities, NSF's Extreme Science and Engineering, and the National Institutes of Health. Okay, that's even still too much like a CV. So I changed the prompt. I asked for, give me a surreal introduction. Dr. Graham's research is not for the faint of heart. With special attention paid to bioethics, conflicts of interest, and health AI, he has been known to blur the line between what is real and what is not. Using artificial intelligence and machine learning, he has unlocked secrets of the universe that were previously thought to be beyond human comprehension. That was going too far. So I changed it to a funny introduction. And if that were not enough to make you swoon, Dr. Graham is also an author. Not one, not two, but 3 books under his belt, with titles like The Doctor and the Algorithm, The Politics of Pain Medicine, and a book entitled Where's the Rhetoric? We hope it's not lost, Dr. Graham. We need it for our next essay. That was legit. And he's published in all the fancy pants journals like Technical Communication Quarterly and PLOS One. His scholarship has even been covered in the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report's, Science and Health Day, and a number of other places. Basically, if you haven't heard of Dr. Graham, you've been living under a rock. That was funny, and I was like, okay, let's change it to scary. Nice. So hold on to your seats as Dr. Graham takes us on a journey into the darkest corners of writing pedagogy and reveals the truth about the horrors lurking beneath the surface of our increasingly AI-driven world. Are you ready to face the unknown? Because once Dr. Graham starts speaking, there's no going back. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Graham, or else.
Well, I know it's stock in trade for the genre, but there is literally no way I can live up to that particular introduction. So I'll do my best. But thanks also, Casey, for the great introduction, and everybody for being here at the beginning of spring break. It's great to be able to chat with you about this. I start with a couple of months ago, Stephen Marsh wrote an op-ed and kind of exploration of AI technologies for The Atlantic, where he wrote that the world of generative AI is progressing furiously. Last week, OpenAI released an advanced chatbot named ChatGPT that has spawned a new wave of marveling and hand-wringing, plus an upgrade to GPT-3 that allows for complex rhyming poetry. Google previewed new applications last month that will allow people to describe concepts in text, see them rendered as images, and the creative AI firm Jasper received a $1.5 billion valuation in October. It still takes a little initiative for a kid to find a text generator, but not for long. With this reflection, this led Stephen Marsh to declare that the college essay is dead, right? And we probably, many of you have seen this essay, and many of you have seen the hand-wringing and concern that follows from this essay. My opinion, as you'll see throughout this, is no. The college essay is in fact not dead, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be some changes to writing and writing pedagogy that have to be reckoned with. So a brief outline of what we're doing today. I'm going to talk about what are large language models, or LLMs, what can and can't they do, how should we think about LLMs and plagiarism, LLMs in short writing assignments, and LLMs in teaching writing. So that's the 10,000-foot view of what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, what are LLMs? So you've probably seen quite a few in the news or online recently. Here's a list of some of the most popularly discussed ones that are available. You see they come from companies like OpenAI, Eleuther AI, Google, Meta, formerly Facebook. And you can see the release dates there and then their measures of the number of parameters they have. We're not going to get into too much detail about what the parameters are, but roughly these numbers are an indication of how sophisticated the language model is. And as you can see, it's accelerating, right? ChatGPT, which has caused the recent explosion and flurry of conversation, is at 175 billion parameters, and OpenAI is promising their 100 trillion parameter model later this year. So we are in the midst of some changes, and we are in the midst of some accelerating changes. So in a nutshell, what do LLMs do? Well, LLMs do what's called next token prediction. So if you feed an LLM a word or a sentence or a paragraph or my CV, it will predict what it thinks the next token should be. You can essentially think of tokens like words. It doesn't quite reduce to that, but that's a good model for considering it. So if I feed an LLM the word "the," there are so many English language sentences that can follow that, right? There's not a lot of constraint on what could possibly come next if I only feed it one word, right? You could get the cat is wearing a hat, the robot wrote this sentence, the concept of ideological interpolation is most famously attributed to Louis Althusser, the sky is falling, and the current state of brinkmanship in Washington is untenable, right? All of these are perfectly plausible sentences that might come after the, and an LLM could produce those for you if you just gave it the one word. However, the more you feed the LLM, the more it constrains the probability for what the next token prediction can be. So if instead of just feeding it one word "the," I feed it the phrase "the cat is wearing a," it could come the cat is wearing a hat, the cat is wearing a tie, the cat is wearing a monocle, the cat is wearing a lavender sweater, the cat is wearing a ham sandwich, right? I have kind of ordered these in terms of what I imagine the probabilities would be of those terms coming next, hat being highly likely, ham sandwich being relatively unlikely to follow that sentence. So essentially, if you're looking under the hood of these LLMs, they use some pretty sophisticated neural networks and computational systems to represent words and tokens numerically, mathematically. They create what are called vectors, which are just mathematical representations of meaning, and they use those vectors to predict the next token, which you can think of as the next word. This underlying approach is why they're commonly called and have been recently referred to as stochastic parrots, right? So stochastics is the sub-area of statistics that involves sequential prediction. Parrots, obviously, metaphor for using language without understanding it, right? And so this is really a good figure to think about what these things are doing and what they're not doing, right? They're not conscious, they're not thinking, they're not making decisions, right? The meaning that is brought to the encounter with the LLM is the meaning brought by the human to the encounter, by and large, but they are fairly robust at predicting plausible sentences, plausible paragraphs, plausible text based on this distribution of word probabilities. So where does this come from? Essentially, these LLMs hoover up massive amounts of text to get the distribution of probabilities for what token might follow any given token. So this is a graphic representation of what's called the pile The pile is the data set used in Eleuther's products. As you can see, it's made up of several pre-existing data sets. One's Pile CC, which stands for Common Crawl. It's basically a nonprofit project that just hoovers up the entire internet and saves it as a data file. Right? We have other things in here like the entire collection of PubMed Central, which is all the open access journal articles that are hosted by the National Library of Medicine. So we have some very high quality text in here from which to make predictions. And then we also have Open Web Text 2, which is very substantially Reddit. And if you've spent some time on Reddit, you know there is actually some really high quality human language text there, some sophisticated arguments, but also a whole lot of racist, misogynistic, ableist invective, and that is also feeding these models pretty substantially. So in this context, that brings me to the next section. So what can and what can't these things do? My gloss for what LLMs are is they're essentially genre signaling engines. So because they're a representation of the probability of what tokens are likely to follow the tokens you fed to it, they do a really great job of screaming what the genre of the writing is, right? So this is a report, this is a poem, this is a song, right? This is a blog post, this is a novel, this is a short story. They scream it so well because especially the more constrained and the more stabilized the genre you're writing in is, the more narrow the probabilistic predictions that can follow from it will be. Right? And so in very constrained, very stabilized, very formalized, very administrative genres, it does a remarkably good job of replicating the human writing that fed the system. So the very first thing I ever fed to an LLM was my required annual peer teaching observation. Right? So those of you among the UT faculty know about every year we have to observe our colleagues in the classroom and write a letter to them explaining how they did, where they might improve. And sometimes it feels a bit onerous even though there is a good purpose behind it. And so what I have here is I was assigned that year to observe Dr. Boyle, who's here, and I just gave it the prompt in bold there. And for those of you who might not be able to see, I'll do a little bit of reading. And I said to the system, write a teaching observation and evaluation of a session of Dr. Casey Boyle's class on computer programming in the humanities. And all the non-bold is what it sped out for me. Right? Dear Dr. Boyle, I am writing to provide an observation and evaluation of the session of your computer programming in the humanities class that I attended recently. The session I observed was focused on the topic of data visualization. You began by providing an overview of the importance of data visualization in the humanities and demonstrated a few examples of effective visualization in scholarly work. The introduction was effective in setting the stage, and on and on and on. Right? So I didn't go to a class for this. I mean, presumably at some point during the class, he offered a module on data visualization, but I didn't see it, and I didn't authentically describe it. But this is coming across as pretty plausible. I could totally see reading something written exactly like this in an annual review, in a promotion and tenure file, and I wouldn't bat an eye, right? It fits the genre very, very well. Let's give you another example. So again in bold, can you explain Plato's Phaedrus? And the LLM provided the response. The Phaedrus is a dialogue written by Plato in which the main characters, Phaedrus and Socrates, have a conversation about love and beauty and rhetoric. Dialogue is set in a rural area outside Athens, and it covers a wide range of topics, including the nature of love, the relationship between rhetoric and philosophy, and the immortality of the soul. And it goes on, and you know what? It's pretty good, right? This is a pretty authentic representation of the content of the Phaedrus, and it's written in a way that is a clear summary and that I could imagine potentially as a student submission or as what is probably modeling something like a Wikipedia article, which is very strongly populating the data that gets fed into these language models. One more example. Can you explain the primary argument in Scott Graham's jargon is just another word for community? So it said jargon is just another word for community is an article written by Scott Graham in which he argues that the use of jargon in academic and professional communities is not a problem, but rather a sign of a healthy community. The primary argument is that the use of jargon is a natural and necessary aspect of any community that is engaged in specialized and technical discourse. All right. I have always wanted to write this article. The summary is relatively authentic to what I have imagined that I would write in this article, but it doesn't exist, right? It is just completely inventing the content of an article that is not out there in the world, but doing it in a very plausible and engaging way. So this points out some of the major limitations of these LLMs. One is hallucinations, right? They just make shit up. Right, and they're happy to do it. They're happy to do it with textual confidence. And if you prompt it to make something up, it will. And if it doesn't know and it's a real thing in the world, it will make it up because it's just doing next token prediction. Google did a very interesting experiment not too long ago where they asked fiction writers to work with these, and the fiction writers loved them, right? Because they were great for world building and for inventing, new characters, new concepts, and they weren't tied down to trying to authentically represent some underlying text or reality. So it worked really well for them. They're not great at citing sources, right? So many of them don't cite sources at all unless you are really good at crafting the prompt so it knows it's writing an academic essay that would be sourced, but frequently the sources that it cites are themselves hallucinated, right? So the foundations of the arguments are just not there, right? But it looks credible, it looks plausible because of the probabilities behind this. Catastrophic forgetting is another major limitation of LLMs, and that means basically most of these have very small available memory for any active text generation. And so you can usually get at best 1 to 5 paragraphs, depending on the model, before it forgets what it was writing about and suddenly makes a big left turn into a different topic. And so this is a big clue if you're reading longer passages that they might be LLM generated if there are these big right turns. Although, it's not necessarily impossible that authentic student writing would have a big right turn in the middle of the essay, so it's not definitive that it was produced by an LLM if you see that, of course. And the last one is biased language is a real problem. Remember how I told you it had onboarded significant amounts of Reddit? Well, that comes across. Quite frequently, a lot of these models have spent serious time before release having people, usually people who are underpaid in the global south, going through the outputs and flagging outputs as being offensive to retrain the model not to produce the offensive outputs. So ChatGPT, for example, produces a relatively low amount of offensive outputs, but Bing's new model has been pretty offensive for a while, but they're working on tamping that down, right? So with that background, I want to think, how should we think about LLMs and plagiarism? Obviously, there's been a lot of concern that there'll be new unprecedented levels of academic misconduct because these make it possible to generate text without writing text. And I do think there are some things that we have to think about in this context, but I think a lot of the public and popular conversation about this is occurring in kind of a vacuum about how much plagiarism there already is. I'm not sure that this will create new plagiarism as much as replace previous models of plagiarism, right? So some recent studies have found that up to 25% of undergraduates will admit to using unauthorized electronic resources in their academic assignments. And then other forms of academic paraphrasing and copying sentences, up to 15% of undergraduates. Getting someone else to do your work for you, though, is at 2%. And so a question that we don't have answered yet is, will undergraduate students think of this as getting something to do their work for them, something that they're more likely to shy away from, or will they think of it as unauthorized use of electronic resources, something that they're somewhat more likely to do? Right? That's an unknown question right now. Answering that is going to require talking to undergrads, getting research on what their perspectives are, even knowing that they're aware of these technologies. But I think it's really important to have any conversations about academic misconduct in the context of what's already there. Speaking of which, there is already a robust contract cheating infrastructure out there, right? Lots of people are paying for papers, more than we would care to admit. And so while, yes, these LLMs raise some new concerns in this area, I think it's important to reflect on, again, what's already there, what's already the underlying reality. Some of this is already quite sophisticated. Recent research out of Rhetoric and Writing have found people using link injection to put referrals to contract cheating services in websites for university writing centers, in websites for university centers of teaching and learning, right? And so they look like authentic university resources, and then the students are being referred to somebody who will take a fee in order to produce an assignment. And so there's an ongoing project monitoring this. You can see it in dozens of universities around the country. UT has not been flagged by the project yet, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't happened since the last investigation. So this is something also that we might need to think about. Again, more than 100 schools. So when I think about academic misconduct and most of the plagiarism experiences I've had prior to these LLMs, there are really two dominant plagiarism profiles, right? So I think about the student who is in an incredibly precarious situation, who is strapped for time, who may have caregiver responsibilities that are preventing them from being able to put a lot more hours into their academic work. And then I also think about the student who is often independently wealthy and happy to spend money on the production of work for class, right? Almost every academic misconduct situation I've ever experienced has fallen into one of these two categories. And I think it's also important to think about what we want to do in the context of things happening in those categories. Category number one has also accelerated since the pandemic. There's lots of data that shows an increase in academic misconduct because of the increased precarity of students' underlying lives, right? And their increased caregiver responsibilities. And so all of this is working towards me being very resistant to think about this very substantively, about policing, about plagiarism, etc. The economic issues will be kicking in. ChatGPT has been free so far, but they recently launched their paid plan, which is going to be $42 a month. Some students will pay $42 a month, but I'm guessing not many, right? And so the question remains, when you think about these two profiles, how much do you want to change your classroom to address these students at the risk of hurting the other students, right? That's an individual choice that every instructor has to make. They have to find that balance between these competing exigencies. I can't tell you what will work for you, but these are the contexts that I think we should think about these questions in. There is a growing movement towards LLM output detection. I think it's very risky and very early stage at this point. So there's a whole cottage industry of websites where you can paste text and it will tell you real or fake. We don't know how accurate these are. Most of these systems are not publishing authentic accuracy reports. We don't know where their data is coming from. There are a lot of very dangerous ideas in development. So one idea that's been circulated recently is a writing fingerprint, where basically there will be a module in Canvas that vacuums up every example of an individual student's writing, from the emails they send you through Canvas to their submissions across campus, in order to say, oh, this submission does not match the previous writing profile of that student. I'm not very comfortable with that, right? I think a lot of us in this room are not very comfortable with that. And then, of course, this to me always comes back to the question of what relationship we want to have with our students. I don't feel super motivated to be very policing in my classroom. Some people may have different approaches. So what are my recommendations to deal with the academic misconduct potentials here? Number one is instructor-student ratios should be appropriate to writing intensive classes, right? You're going to see more of these things like hallucinations, like bad sources, like catastrophic forgetting, if you actually have the time to carefully read your students' submissions. If students are writing a ton in an environment where there's just a ton of students relative to the instructor, that's where you're going to start to see slippage here. I would recommend that instructor efforts to address potential misuse of writing AI should not backslide on recent accessibility gains. I see people on Twitter saying, let's bring back the blue books. Please don't. There are genuine access reasons why those are going by the wayside. Let's see, instructors should avoid reliance on technological solutions, which have shown to have high false positive rates. So Turnitin, which is already integrated into Canvas, has been shown to have high false positive rates, flagging plagiarism where it didn't happen, that create adversarial classroom relationships and that might exploit student writing for corporate profit. Right? A lot of these things that are going to be constantly monitoring the background of Canvas are going to be folded into their own LLMs and sold to third parties. So I think that's something we want to avoid, which in the end is why I think faculty should work closely with ed tech procurement professionals to make sure that LMS integrated technology is pedagogically appropriate, ethically developed, and not harmful to students. All right. How should we think about LLMs and short writing assignments? Right, so as I mentioned before, genre signaling engines is the way that I like to think about these. And that means that LLMs are very good at producing things that they have many, many examples of. So what do they have many, many examples of? Bill Shakespeare, that's for sure, right? How many SparkNote websites are there on Romeo and Juliet? How many Wikipedia article-like things are there on Romeo and Juliet? I had a colleague at UC San Diego do some experiments with this, and he found that they were pretty reliable and pretty accurate with text that had at least 10,000 citations or more, right? And so one of the challenges I have with this context is I've been using short writing assignments, especially Canvas forum posts, as a way to encourage students to read without the anxiety of a reading quiz. Right? So if they post a little description of what they read, it helps ensure that they read, they're ready for the classroom activities, but I don't have that moment of acute assessment. Not sure how viable that's going to be going forward as a solution here. And so I think it's going to be incumbent on all of us as a community to think about how we can encourage student writing or student reading, student participation in outside class activities without defaulting to things like the quick summary that will be very easy to abuse with these LLMs. All right, so what are some of my recommendations here? I think we should consider seriously the role and value of writing assignments, focusing on what they are meant to assess and to the extent to which they truly assess target learning outcomes. And I think the number one takeaway from this is this likely means a substantial reduction in compliance writing assignments. So the things that we assign so that they're ready for something that comes next, right? The things that we assign to demonstrate participation, these are going to be some of the most challenging. And this is a real issue because some of these are great alternatives to students who are, have anxieties around, speaking publicly in the classroom, right? So sample writing assignments can provide a great backstop to that accessibility issue. I don't have good answers here, but I think this is where I think we're going to be really focusing our attention and efforts in the short term rather than the essay. I'll talk about the essay a little bit later. I would recommend that short writing assignments should be localized and contextualized wherever possible, right? If the threshold is roughly 10,000 citations, right, can you ask prompts that students would write short writing assignments about that would meaningfully bring in classroom discussions, that would be contextualized based on other readings in the class? None of these are silver bullets. They're not going to completely eliminate the potential use of LLMs, but they do make it a little bit harder. And at the worst case scenario, they may help prompt students to have to think in sophisticated ways about what they're feeding to the LLM to get an answer, which may then produce the learning outcome we want anyway. All right. So single reading response assignments should focus on the recently discovered or rare texts, right? So the more prevalent it is out there on the internet, the more widely it's been discussed. Just a quick tell me about Romeo and Juliet. Tell me about the Phaedrus. This is hard, but I think that's dead. That's the thing that I think is dead. And assignments addressing canonical work should require dialogic engagement with supporting texts, classroom discussions, etc. Right? Can you bring in a conversation that folds together something you've read, something you've talked about that's less well cited, that's less prevalent on the internet? Right? But of course, this all has to be done in the context of an environment where you have good instructor-student ratios, right? You have to have the time to read these to make sure that it's not full of hallucinations, fake citations, that sort of thing. And again, this is especially problematic for these short writing assignments. I'll admit to having read them rather quickly. Right? If I'm thinking about, write a quick paragraph so that you're ready to talk, I'll go through and make sure it's plausible. But I have not been reading them at the pace that would catch the hallucinations previously. So that's going to have to be a change of practice if I keep these in my pedagogy. All right. So how should we think about LLMs and the teaching of writing? This is the last section. And then I would love to open it up to conversation. All right, so a quick metaphor underlying this. In my metaphor, writing is basketball. But I do think, and I don't think that LLMs are necessarily going to be great to do writing, but I see a lot of opportunity for LLMs as skill and drill, right? Are there things that you can use them to do to enhance writing pedagogy? And I think the answer to that is yes. The things I'm going to talk about today come from an experiment I did in an upper division rhetoric and writing course on rhetoric and algorithms. I had the students write an essay using an LLM and then write a reflection about that essay. And so you'll see moments of both of these that come up throughout what's next. But for me, the interesting pedagogical possibilities are there. Genre awareness and facility, right? If it's a genre signaling engine, we have some interesting opportunities to teach students about how to identify different genres, write in different genres. Evidence management, right? If they've got to chase down the hallucinations and find out if they're real, this is another way to think about background research that we're not necessarily seeing as much as we would like to in the classroom. Writing and critical technology appraisal. Right? We had great work in my class where students were reflecting on how much they hated writing with LLMs. And that's one of the takeaways here. My students hated writing with LLMs, which blunts a little bit of the fear about where we might see them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And lastly, I think revision practice is a very exciting opportunity here that's worth exploring. So LLMs as genre signaling engines. Mostly what happens in my classes, and I assume in yours, students write, they submit, and it takes a little while to get their comments back to them, right? Very rarely am I able to grade the next day. Luckily, sometimes I can grade the next week. What does this mean? This means a delay between student performance and feedback. So if students are trying to adapt to a new genre, write in a style that they've never written in before, they try it out, and then they have to wait a week, 2 weeks, sometimes more, to find out if they did a good job. That's not ideal for learning how to write in a good genre. So because these are genre signaling engines, you can do really interesting things with them to produce immediate feedback. You can literally ask them to write in certain genres, like Casey did with the introduction, or you can give them a prompt that is ostensibly in the genre you want it to write on and see how well it reflects that and what it produces out of the next tokens it generates. So a couple quick examples that are just fun. The Twitterati Ethan Mullick asked for Genesis in the form of a corporate memo and produced that pretty quickly to all employees from God, CEO. Subject creation project status report. Dear team, I am pleased to share with you the progress of our creation project for the past week. Here's what we've accomplished so far, on and right. Instant feedback about what the genre looks like. Instant feedback of taking the exact same content that many of the students will know and reformatting it in a different structure. Here's something I played around with a little bit. I'm sorry, this is a little small, so I'll read it to you. The prompt was, write an essay about the pros and cons of backyard chickens. I had some annoying neighbors recently. Backyard chickens have become increasingly popular in recent years, with many people choosing to raise them, yada, yada, yada. And then the similar prompt, write a personal blog post where the author describes what they love about backyard chickens, right? So these prompts instantly produce writing about the same content in different genres, providing immediate feedback to students in order to get this instant exposure to genre facility. And I'm especially excited about this, not just for the asking it to do, but for having students write, what's the first sentence of your essay? Put that in there. Does what follow look like an essay? Right? That will tell you how strongly your first sentence is communicating the genre that you're writing in, right? Instant feedback. So I think that's pretty exciting. Just a note from one of my student reflections on this. So they wrote, originally I'd wanted to write an academic essay sort of style, but the algorithm quickly let me know that it was going to make a first person sort of petition post, which I fought for a while before I gave up. Continuing with an academic essay would have resulted in a spectacular failure. Right, so we have this moment here where they're recognizing in the process of wrestling with the LLM that that particular LLM would not let them write in the target genre. And I love this little bit of learning. Background research. I don't know about you, but when we get in especially crunch time in the semester, midterm, finals, I find that these citations that are submitted with essays tend to gravitate more and more to the top of the first Google results. right? That we don't necessarily get a ton of deep dive background research, finding the best sources, finding the research that really supports the arguments or claims that the students are making. And so I'm enthusiastic about this as a way of providing some additional support for student research practices, right? So if they generate something full of hallucinations, full of incorrect citations, and they know that that's going to happen, and they know that they're going to be evaluated based on the quality of their citations, it provides a new way to go about Googling, right? A new way to go about doing background research to see if what was produced was real. So I had a student writing a little bit about that. There were multiple incorrect facts based on true facts. The model was quoting a professor, Tom Swearingen, who was part of the transportation department. Swearingen is a professor at the university. However, his true name is Scott Swearingen in the sociology department. And even more interesting was later, the model switched Swearingen's gender. It mentions a $25 million monorail at Virginia Tech, but as far as a quick Google search, I have not been able to find it. Right? It made a URL that did not work, but looks eerily like a proper utexas.edu link, and highlighted in the appendix, right? So again, so the student is having to look through each of these hallucinations, find out how authentic they are, find out what about them is actually real in the world. I love that research process, right? That's exciting for me. Critical technology appraisal. I told you the students hated working with this. Boy, did they hate working with this. Now, this is a unique class, right? This is an upper division rhetoric and writing course. It's full of rhetoric and writing majors who have chosen to build most of their class schedule around writing intensive classes. That's not everybody's student population, and I freely admit that, right? But many of them were very frustrated because they felt that they could produce a better essay substantially more quickly than the LLM writing process would allow, right? What it spat out to them was they could recognize it instantly as substandard. They could recognize it instantly as full of misattributions, hallucinations, and again, they really felt that if they had been able to write just a straight up essay, it would have been an easier and better process for them. However, I did ask them to reflect on where they might use the LLM if it did not count as academic misconduct in a given class. Where could they slot that in? And so one student wrote, I would use the LLM in the future because I like that it does a great job of spitting out so much different information. I would not fully depend on it in the way we're depending on it for this assignment, but I feel like it's a good tool to start the writing process, right? Ideation is creative. It's making stuff up. So if a student is having a writer's block moment, it might help them generate some anchor concepts from which they could build on for a subsequent writing assignment. Another student wrote, in a very limited capacity and for very specific purposes, I would consider using the LLM in the future. In the pre-writing stage of the writing process, in which it was necessary to generate a wealth of ideas and topics, I found the LLM's extensive knowledge of everything written on the internet served as a useful tool. Again, really the students gravitated towards it as an ideation opportunity, not as a full-fledged writing support system. All right. Last thing, revision. You can Google your way to dozens and dozens of writing processes online that look like this, right? That present writing as a step-by-step activity where you go from thinking and ideation to topic narrowing to outlining, gathering your data, drafting, revision, and editing. And if you're thinking about writing in this model, or if your students are thinking about writing in this model, then AI looks remarkably like an opportunity to parachute into the last step. Right? And I think this is what's driven a lot of the sort of moral outrage around AI in university writing in classrooms is, again, when you think about it in this model, it's a cheat. A lot of the classes, and a lot of the classes in the Department of Rhetoric Writing here and in writing departments across the country, try to teach students to adopt a more recursive model of writing. We try to break the notion of this linear writing process and replace it with something that shows ideation, drafting, revision, and especially peer feedback as an essential and central part of the process, right? But this is hard. It's really difficult in the constraints of the classroom to get students to do the revision, right? Your students are like my students. A lot of them gravitate towards last-minute, hasty drafting right before the Canvas deadline submit. And so we don't get as many opportunities as we'd like to practice this more recursive approach to writing. The centrality of this, by the way, I want to say is a really important part of the writing flag on campus. Right, so there are a lot of writing-intensive programs, flag-like programs across the country, and most of them focus on writing intensity. Right, so students must write regularly. They must write a certain volume, produce a certain amount of text, and we do require our writing flag courses on campus to do that. But the second essential criterion of the writing flag is they must receive feedback from the instructor to help them improve their writing and be given the opportunity to revise at least one assignment. Why is that? Because the Writing Flag Committee, following on best practices from rhetoric and writing as a discipline, centers revision as part of the writing process. So we've identified it as the most important thing, that if we're going to take writing as a requirement for all students and distill it to one thing that can be slotted in any course across campus, revision is the thing that we've picked. And again, this is hard because of the structure of student lives, right? Because they sometimes have difficulty producing first drafts. There's a whole cottage industry around Anne Lamont's essay, Shitty First Drafts, begging students to produce something bad so that they can practice revision. And so one thing, and this is, by the way, you can all see this is a public demonstration of 5 LLM co-written essays from my class. The link is hard, but if you just Google UTDWRL, it's the top blog post on the site right now. And what it will show you is for each of these links, there are 5 essays. You can see how many essays how many words the students generated with the LLM, how many words were in the final essay, what the Turnitin score was, and then we gave each of the essays to a group of seasoned first-year writing instructors, and then asked them to assess it both for what grade it would get and how robotic it felt. And you can see there that these essays produced respectable grades, right? None of them knocked it out of the park, but 77 to 88%, those are decent grades, right? And that there was a range of perceived robotiness. Now, what I find most interesting about this is the lowest robotiness score goes with the person who generated the most words but revised the most, right? That shows the most human activity going on here. But I will show you real quick. If you go to, is this going to work? Yep. If you go to the blog, click on essay 2, for example. So you can read the actual essay right here. But what I find really interesting about these, if you skip to the bottom, they have every prompt and every output from the model that they used. So it's a great way to see how much activity went into the revising process, how many things were produced that were left on the clipping floor, how many things that were produced that had to be re-edited by the student in order to fashion them into a high-quality essay. So I'm super excited about this because I think it provides an opportunity essentially to add a second loop-de-loop to our recursive revision process, right? The evidence from these papers is that students are not only doing their regular drafting and reviewing and revising, they're in a recursive process of prompting the LLM, reviewing the output, revising the output, synthesizing different outputs. There's high-level cognitive activity going on here with this particular assignment. And I think you can still, with these things, support high-level student learning outcomes in long essays. Again, I think the short essays, the compliance writing, those are going to be much harder to continue to support in a robust way. But as long as you are asking students to produce something that exceeds the capabilities of the model, the more exciting it becomes for what they can do and what they can practice in sort of the component skills of writing. So I've talked a lot. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Scott. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so how about it?
Yeah.
Do you see any capability of this being used in reverse where we, when we're grading, could use something like that to just say, hey, read this paper, these are my specs, grade it for me?
So people have done that and demonstrated on Twitter. Again, how authentic is it, right? How many hallucinations are being introduced into the assessment? Probably a lot at this point, right? right? So it's the same risk reciprocally. One thing I do think that's promising about this is I've had some luck convincing it to generate assessment rubrics. And so, sometimes, I think they're very helpful to guide assessment and to guide students' writing process, but they are a little tedious to put together, right? And I'd never use any of the ones it produced for me, like unedited, but I have had them produce some for me that look viable with some edits, with some tweaks. So I think that kind of meta infrastructure is much more promising in the short run. I think that if you try to grade an essay with this, students will, in a relatively short amount of time, catch the LLM making up things about their paper as part of your comments on their paper, and they'll be asking some questions. Yep. Yeah.
Tell a little bit more about the prompt and the assignment.
Yes, absolutely.
Use ChatGPT and then revise what it wrote.
Yeah, and so I gave everybody a copy of a standard assignment sheet from their first year writing class on campus, and that assignment was to write an argumentative, an op-ed for the Daily Texan about a local issue on campus, right? And so build an argument about, and so the students would usually write about housing's too expensive in Austin, or it should be easier to get into computer science classes, things like that. The constraints I put on it was that the essay had to be driven by the LLM. So certainly they could prompt it and they could use their prompts in the result, but they had to take the outputs and then revise them into the essay. So it created this very robust recursive process. Now, I'm really glad you asked this question, because it's important to note ChatGPT wasn't out when I did this experiment, right? So this is one model back. It's a little bit more limited. And so in some ways I would recommend slightly older models are better for revision pedagogy. So I may keep using a slightly older model for this assignment because it provides that more laborious revision process that I'm looking to create. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Do you see a big distinction about how everything you're discussing here is going to play out differently in, say, your department and mine, or comparable departments at other institutions where composition is taught, and the subject matter is rhetoric, writing, and the process of doing those things, versus other departments where writing-intensive courses are taking place, but writing might not be the subject?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the biggest variables in the short term are going to be academic labor conditions, right? So that's the variable from department to department that I think is going to matter most. So UT is a fairly wealthy institution, has fairly low instructor-student ratios in a lot of our writing-intensive courses. It's part of the Writing Flag program. There are a lot of other institutions that don't have that financial support for that kind of infrastructure. And so if you've got precarious faculty teaching too large a classes or too many classes spread across too many universities, that's where this is going to be the largest potential for abuse, right? Where they simply just don't have the time and energy in their schedule to carefully evaluate each writing assignment. So I wish I was more optimistic about what universities would do in the face of this to support academic labor. That's the better solution. I'm a little worried they're going to gravitate more towards Canvas plugins and things like that than better supporting faculty. But I think that's going to be the biggest variable. Yes?
Is there a possibility for LLMs to alleviate something that we call, to our great frustration in experience, which is the absentee reviewer situation, where like you wait for like 2 or 3 months and then they will really short review that is really helpful. Do you think that this might speed up? Well, I think I find it trustworthy way of doing this sort of critique, right? Using LLM to make peer reviewers easier time to produce feedbacks, right? Would it be possible to speed up academic publishing?
So people are certainly experimenting with that right now. The Frontiers in journal empire, right? So there's a whole bunch of journals, Frontiers in Geology, Frontiers in X, Y, and Z. have been building some AI systems into the back end of their submission interfaces. They're using them in silent mode right now, but basically they're trying to evaluate if the LLM produces something comparable to the peer review reports that they receive from human reviewers. I am absolutely confident that people are going to do those things. Whether or not that actually does anything other than speed, I'm less optimistic about, right? It may speed time to publication, but I don't know that it will produce better quality science, better quality research. I think that remains to be seen. I do think we're going to see more and more of that on the front end, right? So it does strike me as a promising opportunity for pre-peer review. Right? As these get more sophisticated, as they're scraping things like PubMed Central, trying to get feedback from the LLM might be helpful, though you run the risk of submitting your essay to the LLM system if you want them to keep using it in generation. That's a question. But the other place we're going to see this a lot, it reminds me, Microsoft just invested like $10 billion in OpenAI. I think we're 5 years out from right-click revise paragraph in Microsoft Word. And at that point, this is another reason why I think we have to think seriously about how we're going to use this in pedagogy. Prohibition's off the table once this is part of Microsoft Word.
Well, I'm not super familiar with
Yeah.
ChatGPT. So it doesn't document sources.
Sometimes it makes up sources, but no, it's not actually.
So you can't tell this piece of information came from this source and was integrated for this point.
No.
Okay.
The current system is not doing that. There are some systems that are hooked up to web browsing that will, the model will generate something and then try to find citations on the internet that reflect that. But they are still prone to massive hallucination. Yeah.
Do you think as time advances, companies will try and address the hallucination more intensively? Like, would you say that ChatGPT has less hallucinations than previous iterations?
So I do think they're trying to address it more and more, but I think we're about to hit a ceiling. So right now, most of the hallucination addressing is through human labeling. So again, they're underpaying people in the global south to produce things and label them as fake or label them as offensive. And that's a huge bottleneck because these companies want to make tons of money, and even underpaying people in the global south is a cost on their balance sheet. The other reason we're going to hit a ceiling is we've basically run out of high quality data. They've vacuumed up the entire internet, right? There's not, right? This is one of the reasons actually that they pivoted to a chat model instead of previous LLMs, which were not in a chat model. They're getting us to produce new data for them to improve their model. The other limitation that's coming up is the cost of computation. Right? It's costing millions of dollars to train these, right? You have to take out an entire server farm of GPUs and 100 trillion's the next one out, but I don't know that we're going to see much bigger until the cost of computation comes down significantly. Yeah.
You say that your kids actually hate writing with AI.
Yeah.
And also that prohibition is very soon to be off the table.
Uh-huh.
Blue books aren't
Yeah.
Do you see it as basically essential to working with AI into your writing assignments? Do you think is that basically what teaching writing means now?
So I think it's essential to work it in the same way that you work in other kinds of technological literacy. So imagine the right-click revise paragraph function. For years, I've been working with students not to overly trust the right-click synonym function, right? So I have students who, somebody told me I need to write in a higher academic register. So they go through and pick the biggest words possible, right-clicking, and it makes an essay that doesn't have a lot of sense because they don't know the words behind it. Right? And so I think we're going to have a lot of examples of students rushing to use this because it's available, because the Microsoft interface made it available. And I think it's important to teach them critical skills around when to use it and how to use it. And so, yes, I say essential, but I don't know that I want to. The other thing that gives me pause and gives me concern is the students who, when their essay was submitted to the panel of reviewers, to get a grade, the students who wrote best without AI got the highest grades, right? So, we do risk some loss going forward if everything is with that AI backend. Yes.
I work at the Writing Center, and I've run into a lot of issues with students learning English, relying
Do you see this as something that might affect how people learn English, or do you think it'll increase the amount of students who learn English differently or don't learn writing as well because of the over-reliance on AI generated?
Yeah, so absolutely, people are going to be using this. People who are ESL learners are already using this, right? And that, you know, any language that the model produces, a lot of people are using these models now to teach them computer programming because they have that code built into there as well. So I do think we're going to see a lot of language learning built around these. They do produce, like ChatGPT, for example, largely produces standardized academic English grammar, and so. And yeah, I don't know. I'm reticent to weigh in on what would be the definition of overuse, right? You know, I think that it's a challenging environment to decide how much technological assistance is too much. I'd want to talk to some ESL experts before I go too far into that. But yeah, it's going to happen, and we're going to, as communities, have to think about how we're going to address it and how we're going to try to guide it to happen in ways that are most conducive to learning. Yeah.
Well, you were talking about like your class where you had a lot of students who had sort of made their schedule around writing intensive courses, like their goal is to learn writing as a major. What do you feel about the acquisition of skills like brainstorming or revision for students in some of those first year classes who weren't able to have that experience of acquiring at least a bit of those skills while in high school?
Yeah. So the one thing I guess I want to take, if I had one takeaway from this, is I would recommend that people not do immediate major changes to their pedagogy. We are so far out ahead of the good educational research that needs to be conducted. We need rigorous studies to determine how this affects learning. What are the best ways to roll it out that optimize and maximize learning? And that work is in progress now. That work is starting and continuing in writing departments and education departments. And I think that while we do need to be mindful of this, I also think after a couple of years of COVID, we've done a lot of emergency pedagogy lately. I don't think we're doing ourselves or our students any favors by making more emergency adjustments. So I think it's okay to give ourselves permission to wait until some of that data comes back, which is another way of saying I don't have a good answer to your question because I want to see studies of students in first-year writing classes using AI and not using AI, and using AI in different ways, so I know the ways to fold it into those classrooms that will maximize the learning that we're looking for. Yeah?
I'm curious if you got any feedback from your students on the sense of ownership they had over the essays they wrote, or also if it made them like reflect more on their own skills and shortcomings as writers.
I did not get feedback about that, but that's my fault. I didn't engineer the reflection prompts to produce that. I bet they have strong opinions about that. So I may try to work that into the next iteration of this assignment. But I will say that does remind me that there is, if you think about this getting used more broadly, there's a real authenticity concern around here, both by the writers and the recipients. So one company did a very unethical experiment using ChatGPT to give online psychotherapy without telling people. And when those people found out, they were understandably furious and kept pointing to, no, the reason this works is because I know a person is listening to me. Right? That was their, subjective experience of the real value of therapy, and to have that pulled out from under them, right? So there is going to be some, as these become more pervasive, does it only work if people don't know? Well, that's a serious ethical concern that we want to figure out how to address. Yeah.
This talk focused a lot on the undergraduates that are here right now, but I want to harken back to this idea of the high school student, and I'm wondering if you have thoughts on how this software might affect the students that get to our university, how this affects the college application essay, for example, the personal essay as opposed to the research.
Yeah, I mean, that is such a formalized genre with so many examples online. The way that they're currently written are going to be so easy to have an LLM generate them for you. And so, this is not an area of expertise of mine per se, but I hope that admissions committees and the admissions office are thinking about that. I don't know. I have mixed feelings about a lot of the admissions processes anyways, since they tend to select for privilege over anything else, and I'm worried that writing assessment does that especially well. So I don't have a good answer for you, but you raise a wonderful point. Yeah. Looks like
One more question?
I've been doing some creative writing and role building recently, and I would say I feel a little bit of personal ownership of the stuff that it has generated or made a foundation for, because then I can kind of twist that in my own way. So just to answer that a little bit.
I'll pass along a question for one of my students.
Yeah.
Is, why do I need to learn how to write in college if I can use ChatGPT when I'm graduated and done? Like, unless I'm going into academia, all of my writing can be done by ChatGPT.
Well, I would say if it matters whether or not your writing is true, you may need to learn to write. Like, that's going to be a serious part of it. I mean, I don't want to just dismiss it out of hand, because there's a lot of compliance writing in corporate America that people would rather not do.
I mean,
Right,
these are my
yeah,
honors students
right.
who have chosen a writing intensive class.
Right.
And then it's
But,
really,
you know,
this is a
I think it depends a lot on sector, right? So people are trying to disruptively innovate in the law right now, and it is becoming a huge issue as legal arguments that are being generated by this invent precedent, and then lawyers are being called on it. Like, I think it strikes me as a especially dumb move in the tech sector to market a failed product to lawyers who then sue you for producing low quality things that cause their argument to lose. But I see we're out of time.
I think,
Yeah.
I wanted to.
Oh, go.
Yeah, I think one response to this is that human will always be the liability sponge.
Mm-hmm.
Always. And so
Yeah.
if you're relying on ChatGPT, no matter what sector you're in, and there's something wrong with that, or someone becomes liable, you are still the author.
Yep.
And our notion of authorship is still really strong. That's pretty much tied to our juridable sort of cultures of shame and blame, right? So, why they need to learn how to write? So they don't get
So they don't get sued.
or blamed.
There you go.
Yep.
That's my answer.
Thanks everyone for coming out.
Thank you, everyone.